Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, where does faith in the Buddhist context come from?
There are many varied answers to this question. Some say that it comes from witnessing. If you witness a person practice and achieve enlightenment, you'll be faithful that practice works, and that you too could achieve enlightenment. Others say it is a gift bestowed upon us by the Buddhas due to their universal compassion.
Fascinating. How can they gift us something like faith?
The Buddhas teach us that all sentient beings arise and cease due to causes and conditions, and that we all share the nature of impermanence, emptiness, and non-self. Because of this common shared nature, we're indistinct from each other and from the gods, the Buddhas, the Pretas, the animals, and the demons. We are all one and not apart.
So if something happens to one of us, or if something is done to one of us, then in a way it happens to all of us.
Exactly.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Amitābha in Buddhism. Who is Amitābha? What are some stories about him? How ought we understand him? We hope you enjoy. So, start up. Who is Amitābha?
Amitābha is one of the many Buddhas discussed in Buddhist text, doctrine, and history. His name in Sanskrit is Amitābha, meaning Buddha of infinite light, or Amitāyu, the Buddha of infinite life. In Chinese, he is called Amitofo, and in Japanese, he is called Amida Butsu, or Amida Nyorai. We know him from our discussions of Pure Land Buddhism as the main Buddha of worship. Amitābha is not exclusive to Pure Land, however. He also appears in Shingon, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Tendai Buddhism, Hui-yüan's Buddhism, and more. He's one of the oldest Buddhas in all of Buddhist religious history, potentially even being one of the first Buddhas to be worshipped after the death of Shakyamuni. There are remnants of texts and icons of Amitābha throughout Central Asia, such as present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, Western China, and Tibet, that all date all the way back to the 1st century CE. It is commonly thought that Amitābha was a Taoist deity, or a deity from other religions in the area representing immortality or infinite light, and that he was assimilated into Buddhism after it reached those regions of Asia in the 1st century. We can't know very much about the history of Amitābha as a deity prior to the birth of Pure Land Buddhism because there is only limited archaeological and textual evidence. But it is speculated that Amitābha predates Pure Land Buddhism. He is thought of as having an immeasurable lifespan, and the explanations for why this is the case vary. One is that he is said to be the most compassionate of all Buddhas, and this creates merit that lengthens his life. Some Pure Land Buddhists think he is the primordial Buddha referenced in the Lotus Sutra, who manifests as all other Buddhas for the purpose of skillful means. The likely historical reason is that he is adapted from a Taoist immortal or a deity of immortality from another religious tradition. His other name, Amitāyu, Buddha of infinite light, speaks yet again to this universal compassion. All Buddhas have a tuft of white hair in between their eyes that they can use to project light. This is one of the 32 marks of a Buddha. Amitāyu can project this light to all realms of the universe and touch every being in it and bestow grace upon them, again due to his great compassion. This is the nature of and the reason for Buddha nature, according to some Pure Land Buddhists.
How did he become associated with Pure Lands?
In the 1st through the 3rd centuries CE, we see the appearance of sutras that mention Buddha fields, or Buddha Kshetra. These are the worlds, realms, or environments in which Buddhas operate. The earth as we know it now is the Buddha Kshetra of Shakyamuni. Sukhāvatī is the Buddha Kshetra of Amitābha, and Abhirati is the Buddha Kshetra of Akshobhya. We've discussed each of these at one time or the other over the course of many episodes. Each fully realized Buddha has their own Buddha Kshetra, or Buddha field, and it's filled with occupants who have received the teaching from that Buddha. The reason every Buddha has a Buddha Kshetra is because they create it with their bodhisattva vows. They fold all the power that they have accrued from doing good works into creating a whole other realm. While creating it, they vow to save every sentient being in it. The nature of the Buddhakashetra is proportional to the Bodhisattva's works as a bodhisattva. Shakyamuni's Buddhakashetra contains purity and impurity. As a result, there are inhabitants of all 6 realms here. Amitābha, on the other hand, as we will soon discuss, did such good work as a bodhisattva that his realm is populated only by bodhisattvas who are one death away from Buddhahood and nirvana. These Buddhakashetras and their Buddhas were presented in the texts as objects of visualization. In texts whose purpose is instructing the practitioner in visualizing the Buddha and his Pure Land, you begin to visualize the land first, and then the Buddha and all his clothing, characteristics, and more, and then you begin to visualize the whole thing. Sukhāvatī is to the west, another evidence point suggesting that Amitābha existed in Taoism first, given that that's where the gates of immortality are in that religion. Visualization of the Pure Lands became very popular as a practice because there was a sutra or a number of sutras in the Pali Canon that claimed that this visualization practice, known as Buddha Anusmriti or Buddha visualization, could lead to nirvana, magic powers, and more. However, although the core idea of a Buddhakashetra and the practice of visualization first developed in India, the practice of Buddha Anusmriti went on to become much more popular in China, and so Pure Land developed alongside Chinese Mahayana Buddhism much more than alongside Indian Mahayana Buddhism or Indian Buddhism in general. It eventually became fully subsumed under the Mahayana umbrella, a common historical phenomenon. We talk about Mahayana as an edifice, but it's a descriptive term rather than a prescriptive term. In other words, many different schools of Buddhist thought and many different monastic and doctrinal lineages all existed in a very loose and overlapping ecosystem, and many of them came to be collectively understood as mainstream Mahayana much later in history. There wasn't an institutional decision made to take everybody who practiced visualization, call them the Pure Land sect, and then label them as Mahayana. As we've discussed before, these sects were not as strictly defined in most of Buddhist history as they are today. For example, very few people labeled themselves as a Pure Land Buddhist until the 15th century or so at the earliest. But visualization practice and the textual tradition of Pure Land existed and circulated among Buddhist thinkers and practitioners throughout most of Buddhism's history. As a tradition of text and practice, Pure Land cuts across artificial and relatively recent sectarian divides. I say all of this to speak to how Amitābha was and is understood across different strains of Buddhist thought. Amitābha has a place in Yogacara, Zen, Shingon, Vajrayana, Hui-yüan's, Tendai, and more. He may not have been the main object of worship in these traditions, but he was venerated, his Pure Land was acknowledged and visualized, and his texts were read and studied in all of them. In Vajrayana, Shingon, Tendai, and Hui-yüan's, for example, he is one of the 5 wisdom Buddhas alongside Amoghasiddhi, Vairocana, Ratnasambhava, and Akshobhya. These are the Buddhas who are thought to have attained the highest spiritual advancement, and they each have Buddhakashetras in their associated direction. In addition to Amitābha's to the west and Akshobhya's to the east, Amoghasiddhi has a land to the north, Ratnasambhava has a land to the south, and Vairocana has a land in the center. This group of 5 commonly appears in mandalas, in statue programs, at temples, and in art and iconography across China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Amitābha also has a mantra associated with him in Shingon and Vajrayana, which reads in Sanskrit as Om Amitābha Hri, or in Japanese as On Amirita Te Se Kara Un. This is in addition to calling out the name of Amitābha in the Nenbutsu, or the Nyanfo. The Nyanfo in Chinese is read Namu Amitofu, and the Nenbutsu in Japanese is read Namu Amida Butsu. Amitābha also commonly appears in the center of a triad, usually with Avalokiteshvara on the right and Mahastamaprapta on the left. These two attend to Amitābha in his Pure Land, and so temples that enshrine him will often have these 3 in a statue program. This helps practitioners visualize the Pure Land and create a karmic connection to it, which facilitates their rebirth in it after they pass away. He iconographically typically comes in 2 forms. One is the standing descending form, which represents him coming down to you at the moment of death to welcome you into his Pure Land. In this form, he's standing with his left arm extended downward and the palm facing the viewer, with his thumb and forefinger touching, and the right hand at shoulder height, palm forward, also with the thumb and forefinger touching. This pose is his mudra, which symbolizes his universal compassion. The left hand reaching downward invites the lowest of beings, such as demons and pretas, into the Pure Land, while the raised right hand invites higher beings, such as gods. The other form is his seated form, where he sits cross-legged with his palms face up in his lap, his thumb tips touching, while the tips of his fingers face upward, and the backs of his fingers touch. This is a version of a mudra of meditation, and this is the form in which he appears to inhabitants of his Pure Land.
What are some stories about him?
Let's start with the earliest sutras dedicated to him. He's mentioned in over 20% of Mahayana sutras, but there are the famous 3 that are entirely dedicated to him: the longer and smaller Pure Land Sutras, and the Contemplation Sutra. We've actually read the Contemplation Sutra and part of the longer Pure Land Sutra, and there will be links to those episodes in the show notes. The longer Pure Land Sutra begins with him in a past life as a king known as Dharmakara. Dharmakara encounters a Buddha known as Lokesvara, or sometimes Lokeshvara Raja, another name for Avalokiteshvara, and he decides to renounce his kingdom and become a disciple of the Bodhisattva path. After doing so, he makes the 48 Bodhisattva vows that we read and discussed in the longer Pure Land Sutra episode. These vows construct the Pure Land and describe its visual characteristics, its inhabitants, and what one has to do to be reborn in it. If you remember, the earth there is perfectly level and flat. There are jeweled trees, everybody has the exact same physical characteristics, they all sit on lotus thrones, and there are birds that sing the Dharma, even while the leaves of jeweled trees tinkle in melody of the Dharma, and while the Amida triad of Mahastamaprapta and Avalokiteshvara and Amitābha all preach the Dharma at the same time. The Contemplation Sutra goes into much more detail about these visual characteristics, and it also describes the 9 levels of rebirth we discussed in our episode on that sutra. Each of these levels corresponds with how good or evil the person was in their life, and they each come with varying welcoming parties. Lower level rebirths may only have a bodhisattva or 2, and higher level ones will have Amitābha himself and his attendants to welcome the person into the Pure Land. Lower level rebirths are also reborn in a sort of purgatory situation, where they are in an unopened lotus bloom for varying amounts of time, and when the bloom opens, that is when they're said to have finally made it to the Pure Land. Higher level rebirths are automatically born onto an opened lotus bloom, and the lowest level rebirths have to stay in the unopened bloom for increasingly long amounts of time, proportional to how evil they were in their lives. Other stories about him come later in Buddhism's history as visualization practice of him and his Pure Land become increasingly popular in China and Japan. For example, it is explained later that the form in which he appears to the visualizing meditator is his Sambhogakaya, or his celebration body or reward body. This is the part of the Trikaya, or the 3-body doctrine. The other 2 bodies are the Nirmanakaya, the physical body, and the Dharmakaya, the body of teachings. Amitābha is understood to have all 3 of these bodies, and to be the original and primordial Buddha that is described in the Lotus and Lankavatara Sutras by some Pure Land thinkers. The reason he is thought of as this Buddha is because Pure Land thinkers honed in on him as an exemplar of universal compassion, which was/is the central core of Buddhist doctrine and practice. Because he welcomes any being into his Pure Land, except those who have committed one or more of the 5 gravest sins, he is thought of by Pure Land Buddhists as having the widest gate, or being the most inclusive Buddha. Later on, they even remove the qualifier about the 5 gravest sins, and he becomes understood as welcoming literally every being into his land. Because of this, Amitābha comes to be understood as being universal compassion itself, and that universal compassion is the primordial universal force that manifests as all the different Buddhas of the ages. In other words, Amitābha is Buddha with a name and a body, but those are simply characteristics that the very idea of universal compassion takes on in order to be rendered intelligible by sentient beings. This is not the only interpretation of him or of the primordial Buddha out there. Other Buddhists have different interpretations of this primordial Buddha, such as Shingon Buddhists who understand it to be Vairocana. But either way, Amitābha comes to be understood as universal compassion itself. In later Buddhist history, such as in the medieval period in China and Japan, visualization of Amitābha at the moment of death specifically became a very popular practice, and so there came to be many stories of him appearing to dying monks and meditators. These stories were compiled and written to convey moral instruction. There are several compilations which describe dreams or reports of people achieving birth in the Pure Land. They loosely follow a format such as, so-and-so person was practicing visualization at the moment of death, and then such and such monk reported dreaming of a cloud of purple gold. There's a lot more to these stories than that, but this is one of the common patterns. The purpose of these texts is manifold. One is to take nobility and high-ranking monks who have passed away and posthumously make hagiography of them. These stories claim that, since this person successfully achieved birth in the Pure Land, you can infer that they were very virtuous and compassionate in life. Another purpose was to convince people of the efficacy of visualization practice. There are some stories involving unnamed commoners, criminals, peasants, and the like, who are visited by bodhisattvas or by Amitābha himself, and subsequently being reborn in the Pure Land, even if they were reborn at one of the lower levels of rebirth. The reason for this is to demonstrate that moral behavior leads to favorable rebirths, but also to show that visualization at the moment of death works really well, even for immoral beings. Another purpose of these texts is to assuage anxieties people had about their deceased loved ones. Rebirth in the Pure Land after death poses an incredibly important question to the living. How does one know that their loved ones were reborn there? These texts answer that question and render rebirth in the Pure Land as verifiable through dreams, visions during meditation, or even by the colors of smoke at the deceased person's cremation. They will report that a grieving person dreamed of Amitābha's visit to the dying person at the moment of death, that they had a vision during meditation, that the color of the smoke when they were cremated was a certain color, or that they left relics in their cremated remains. These sorts of things indicate successful rebirth in the Pure Land. In this way, Amitābha is a very active figure when it comes to rebirth in the Pure Land. Think of how many people die every day. Most Pure Land Buddhists believe that Amitābha not only visits a huge portion of those people at the moment of their deaths, but also visits their relatives, loved ones, or friends later on in their dreams or in visions to confirm that the person was reborn there. In that sense, all of these stories of rebirth are directly about Amitābha, even if he doesn't really directly appear in them.
How ought we understand Amitābha?
This is a core question that Pure Land practitioners and thinkers have been engaging with for 2,000 years. The quick and simple answer is that there are as many ways to understand him as there are people who believe in him, but that's sort of cheap and doesn't advance the conversation. I've presented a couple of common ways to understand him here so far, such as his role as the primordial Buddha, and/or that he is the very idea of universal compassion. There are other interpretations out there as well. For example, Shinran, the founder of Jodo Shinshu in Japan, understood Amitābha as a manifestation not only of universal compassion, but also of faith. We've talked about faith and its complicated definition and function in Buddhism, but if I start from zero, I might be able to make sense of what's going on here. This is some really complicated stuff, and sometimes even I get it wrong, so keep in mind that I may mess some of this up. I mentioned before that Amitāyus can project divine light to all realms of the universe and touch every being due to his great compassion. According to some Pure Land Buddhists, this is the source or the reason for Buddha nature. This Buddha nature is also non-distinct from faith. In other words, Amitābha, being faith itself, is a shared nature and characteristic we all have because of his universal compassion. He is ultimately the cause for the existence of faith, as a state of mind or a state of being. He has bestowed it upon us all because he is very powerful, and he's very compassionate, so much so that he will share it with every sentient being in all realms. This is faith in the truth and efficacy of the Dharma, and also faith in Amitābha's compassion, which leads us to the Pure Land. Because we are all automatically bodhisattvas who are only one rebirth away from Buddhahood when we go there, this faith is simultaneously Buddha nature. As part of this interpretation of him, Shinran discussed Amitābha in his causal stage and his effect stage. When he was Dharmakara, he was in his causal stage. That's when he made his vow that constructed the Pure Land. Because of his inconceivable merit, these vows superseded all other vows made by all other Buddhas, allowing it to include and involve all sentient beings everywhere. His effect stage is the stage he is in now, where the Pure Land is constructed, all of his vows are fulfilled, and he's a fully realized Buddha. He has gifted all sentient beings with faith, and by extension, Buddha nature, even if they don't know or believe it. He appears to us when we engage in visualization or when we're reborn in the Pure Land. These stages or forms are two sides of the same coin. They're both Amitābha, and they're both constantly happening all the time. There's no aspect of the causal stage that ended in the past, sequentially leading to the effect stage in the present or the future. He's simultaneously causing all of us to have faith and Buddha nature now, and to be welcomed into the Pure Land, and also living the reality of the effects of that cause. He is always vowing and always fulfilling those vows. His realization of Buddhahood is not one and done, it's ongoing. The primacy and the universality of Amitābha in Pure Land Buddhism has led him to be likened to a Protestant view of the Christian God. This comparison is fueled by the circumstances of the founding of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, which scholars in the past have thought was very similar to Martin Luther and the Reformation in Europe. Many Protestants say, God is love, God is in each of us, God welcomes all, etc. And so you can see how when Pure Land thinkers say, Amitābha is compassion, Amitābha is faith, Buddha nature in all of us, and Amitābha welcomes all. Then we're quick to compare him to that Protestant view of God. I don't like this comparison for a few reasons. One important reason is that Western Christian scholars have compared tons of moments in Buddhism's history to the Reformation, and while they may look like that superficially, invoking the Reformation also invokes a lot of the specific European historical context and baggage that does not apply to Asia at all. Because it is usually Protestants making the comparison, it also invokes a lot of theological baggage that is biased in favor of the Protestant side of the Reformation. They unconsciously, or even consciously in some cases, favor whichever kind of Buddhism they choose to stand in for Protestantism, and whichever Buddhists they choose to stand in for Martin Luther, because they think of the Reformation as this great democratization of faith, and this great moment where one man spoke truth to power and broke from a corrupt and bloated Catholic institution, and all this other stuff. None of this baggage applies to any moment in Buddhist history. While it may superficially appear so, deeper investigation reveals that the comparison simply falls apart. Be aware that that interpretation of Amitābha is out there, but also remember that it doesn't really hold up.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Amitābha. Join us next time where we will be discussing anger and rage in Buddhism. How ought we understand anger and rage in Buddhism? What are the different types of anger in Buddhist thought? What is the role of anger and rage in Buddhism? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.